Let's introduce themselves. It's a special moment. So let's start right here with this young man.
This one. My name is Greg Bilson. I'm a D&D producer for Wizards of the Coast. I have faced many deaths at the hands of Mr. Perkins.
My name is Chris Perkins. I am the DM for Acquisitions Incorporated. I also kill characters weekly, Monday and Wednesday nights in my home campaigns.
James, why we say Chris Perkins, DM of the Stars.
My name is James Wyatt. I work at Wizards of the Coast where I'm the creative manager. I also wrote the Dungeon Master's Guide.
My name is Mike Rahulik. I'm also Gabe. I play Jim Dark Magic in Acquisitions Inc. And I also run my own personal game Monday nights.
And I'm Mike Failauer, Penny Arcade business guy, and somehow my introduction to D&D in first grade turned into this, so thank you all for coming.
So one of the things we like to do with the Art of the Dungeon Master panel, first off, have you guys been here before? How many people have been to the ones in previous years? Oh, okay, that's cool. So mostly a new crowd. What we like to do is kind of like talk about the nuances of dungeon mastering. One of the things we don't get into so much is mechanics, because those things we can talk to you about after the seminar if you like, but we kind of talk about like how you steer a campaign, how you start one, how you finish it, how you encourage role playing, that kind of thing, how you incorporate your players into the storytelling. That's the art of the dungeon master, and that's what we try to do. So I'm going to have this panelist here. We're going to talk about a couple of things, and then probably about a third of the way through, we'll turn it over to some Q&A, and you guys can ask some questions. But we would appreciate it if, like, rather than get into mechanics, you want to talk about like the bigger issues. Panelists, let's start with this. Let's say you got a bunch of players, and they want to play. How do you start a campaign? How do you get it going? How do you get the guys all involved in it and actually make them invested in the campaign and push it forward? We'll go with you, Greg.
One of the first challenges I find is finding players. That can be sometimes a little difficult if you're from a small town or just maybe don't have a local game store. Working at Wizards, not usually a problem for me, but the next thing I look at is the different types of players. I think that trying to pick the people that are going to be in your game really helps, because if you look at the relationships that are going to develop, these people are going to be in a game for a very long time together potentially, and well, you kind of want them to get along. So I'll pass it on to somebody else though.
Okay, that'd be over to you, Chris Perkins.
When I start a game, I try to put together a story document for what kind of sort of big stories I want to tell in the game, and I give that to the players, and hopefully that inspires their character ideas. One of the key elements of the document at the end is that I put this section specifically for the players, saying, here are a bunch of story hooks that you can basically latch your character onto if you want. You're so-and-so from such and such, and you're an orphan, and you know your family was killed by whoever. And just make sure that the document is sort of
I haven't orphaned anybody in ages.
So the players can think about where their character's going to be in that world, and then giving them specific things to latch onto.
By the way, how many guys do that? Do you send out an email ahead of time or something that actually roots people in your world when you do it? Yeah, that is a huge thing to do. Like, it gets people thinking early and often about the hooks in the world. It's very cool.
And if you're Chris, it's 40 pages long.
Yeah. With maps and annotated legends.
I did something very similar for the game that I started up this year, but I basically printed up a bunch of index card-sized handouts that outlined backgrounds for characters and gave them a reason to be on the same boat. So I started the campaign with everybody on a ship to the town of Haven, and their own little agenda tied into that. One of my players is sitting down here saying, but I've also been trying to really let the story of that campaign be led by the players. I've got themes that I'm bringing in repeatedly that I tied into those backgrounds, but I'm trying to let them do what they want to do, and rather than map out a story ahead of time, give them a feeling of being rooted in what's going on, and let them take it from there.
I know, Mike, you wanted to speak to this, so let's like transition into this actually, which is how do you encourage role playing? And I think picking up on what James is saying, I think it's an important point, but how do you encourage role-playing in your campaign? How do you give those people that root? Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I sort of had a different situation in that when I started my campaign, none of us had ever played Dungeons and Dragons before. So we were all really learning it at the same time, even me as a dungeon master. And so even now 2 years into our campaign, it's still kind of tricky for a lot of my players to feel comfortable enough to say a line or act as their character rather than saying, when I started playing in the podcast, I always said, Jim does this. And people thought that, that sort of became Jim speaking in the third person. I didn't feel comfortable acting out. So for my players, what I did is at the very beginning, I had each of them write down a secret from their past and give that to me. And that sort of helped them think about their character and things that only they knew about their character. And then what I like to do is on a given night, I'll send out an email and I'll say, I don't want to be a hard ass, but be conscious of this for tonight. Instead of having table talk, think about what your character knows and how they would talk to the other characters at the table. Not, Brad talking to Kiko. Think about Benetrix talking to Merrick. And so I try to give them little things to think about in each game, and that seems to help.
Yeah, how many of you guys were at the Acquisitions Inc. Live show yesterday? The funny thing is, Will likes to act, right? But I gotta say, he had some great one-liners, didn't he? And the thing is, like, he was in character the whole time, and I really, Ao felt, you felt it, right? He's like, roar, and it's like the things he said and did, you're like, oh, that's really cool. And that really does bring up the whole atmosphere of the table. You're like, oh, nice job, yeah.
Well, and as you as the Dungeon Master, if you feel comfortable doing voices like Chris does, it makes everyone else feel more comfortable.
That's the point.
You really lead that ship.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As the Dungeon Master, you really do set the tone for how the table's going to be. If you're joking around, people are going to take it that way. But at the same token, if you actually invest in the story and the voices and the entire thing, they feel more comfortable actually opening up and doing the same thing. Mike, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, just a little bit on going back to something that James said about letting the story build itself with his ship. This goes back to the how do you start a campaign thing. All the pre-planning is really wonderful if you have the time to put together the 40-page story document, do that. And if you have the kind of players that will respond to your emails with character development and some backstory, that's great too. But if you don't, the important thing is just start the campaign. Right? Those details will reveal themselves at the table, especially if you use something like Mike did, just encourage that little planted seed, one secret. You can watch it grow. You don't have to start going with the entire ship build. You just just launch. It'll work itself out.
Actually, one of the greatest sessions, which I played many of these guys up here and several guys in the audience, the diceless session is when you know as a DM you've arrived, when you don't roll any dice all night and you just sit there and role play and talk it through. And wow, I think we could do this, and what about this? It's like, that's awesome. You as a DM are like, I didn't prepare anything, and you guys are totally running the boat. It's very cool. Again, diceless session. Okay, so we've talked about how to start a campaign. Now let's talk about how to end a campaign. And specifically, at some point, you have a natural end to the campaign, either because people are like, you've done it, you've explored everything you need to, or you've gotten to the natural level you want to be at with the campaign. But somehow you need to spot when it's time to move on to the next session, the next idea. And so, Greg, what do you think?
Well, getting back to one of the things that Mike said, I think building that investment in the characters from the beginning actually tells you when it is time to end a campaign. The characters are going to go through many transitions and periods in which probably the backgrounds that they invested in the beginning are going to come back over and over again. And for me, what I look at is when they've sort of reached the point where they've exhausted all of those different character nuances, where it's kind of culminated in either their character making some sort of great revelation or great realization, something changing in them. That's actually what I let dictate an end of a campaign, not necessarily when I've decided that, oh, they're going to fight the big bad, or they're going to all die. That when the characters have come to that end point sort of as a group, that's what tells me, okay, maybe this is time to start wrapping up the campaign.
Chris?
TBK. I could have, no. No. I'm very nice. I really couldn't say it much better than that. When I start my campaign, I sort of lay down kind of 3 major campaign arcs to help sustain the campaign over time. And the characters sort of drift in and out of these arcs. It's not like they're focused on one thing for a tremendous length of time, but they're constantly reminded about this bad thing happening over here to the west, and this terrible thing happening over here to the east, and this other thing with this bad guy that they let get away at level 1 who's now coming back at level 13 to kick their ass. But as Greg said, for me it's a combination of getting to the endpoints of those conflicts and making sure that every character has really had their chance to grow. And I think of my campaign almost like a series of TV episodes, like seasons.
Like Buffy.
Exactly, or like whatever. Like some show.
That's actually still
produced in the last year. But so the episodic approach, what that sort of trains me to do is think about, okay, what character or characters are really going to get their moment in the sun this week, and just as a DM, find ways to engage those characters, and also find ways for the other characters to help them out, and keep throwing minor quests at these characters to keep them engaged personally as well as with the big stories of the campaign.
And just to build on that, I have to say, if you throw out innocuous little details at the start of a campaign, you can build on later. That is very cool because you can pay it off. You have time to decide which way you're going to go with it, but you do little things like the players don't know what that means. You're like, oh, okay. And then later you'd be like, well, it really meant this to the larger story
Or
arc.
sometimes the characters will just make stuff up. Or
Yes.
the players will actually
Yes.
come to their
Yes.
own conclusions, and you'll go, oh, that's much better.
Yes.
I can-
You know what the real art of the Dungeon Master is? The players. That's the truth. The players will actually give you more information, usually in a campaign, that you could think of on your own, and it's seizing the right moments to go with
Yeah, the best dungeon masters listen to what's going on at the table.
Yeah.
Especially the really bad ideas, when they're worried about something coming, like, oh no, I bet behind the door is, a beholder, you're playing a goblin. Oh yeah, now it's a beholder. I was playing with, you guys know it, so we call it chumming the dungeon. Definitely when the players chum the dungeon, yeah, take that and run with it.
They're also letting you know what they think is an acceptable challenge, right? Aren't they? They're tipping their hand like, I hope it's not a beholder. They kind of do think it's a beholder. So you're like, well, they will accept a beholder. Good, done. How about you?
I guess what's bubbling around in my head is some of the less ideal circumstances under which campaigns come to an end. I mean, a TBK is a terrible way to end a campaign, actually. Although it's an interesting way to transition a campaign from one phase to another. But sometimes, like, I read this Dungeon Craft column for D&D Insider, and I started off writing this campaign that I invented for the column and then started running at lunchtimes at the office. And I realized at one point that we hadn't played in like 2 months. And I was really much more excited about thinking about the other campaign I wanted to run than I was in thinking about that one. And there just wasn't a lot of energy or enthusiasm around the campaign for anybody involved. And I just had to finally say that it was time to let that campaign go away and pursue something that I was more interested in. It turned out a different group and a completely different campaign, which is a fine luxury if you have players to choose from. But harder to pull off if you're gaming with the only gamers in your town and you realize, I don't really like these people.
Wow, that was a little autobiography.
I don't think that's actually a problem with me.
Does anybody here, are they gaming with the only gamers in town and they don't like them?
And I'm sitting
Hey,
right
you're
next to
doing it
them.
again, they're with your friend. Mike, you want to build on that?
Well, I mean, I've never ended a campaign. I mean, my plan is to end it at 30 because that's how high the books go. To sort of talk about dropping sort of story ideas early on and making yourself seem smarter than you actually are. Early on, like I think in terms of video games, obviously, because that's where I'm coming from. And so when I sat down to think about my campaign, I decided that they would have to fight each of the 5 heads of Tiamat, and that would take them through the entire course of the game, right? And each head is sort of a season, like we were talking about. And in the very beginning, I drew a picture for them that showed Tiamat trapped in the center of their world with a head chained to these different continents, right? And there was a group that was protecting each head. And I just made up names, like the white mask, the whatever, red hand, and I did the green dream. I have no idea what that meant. Well, they've just now gotten to the green head, and it just so happens that I've been learning about the Feywild. And so I took them to the Feywild, and I've just been playing and decided that the Feywild in my campaign is actually a dream of the sleeping green head. And they look at me and they're like, "You had this plan 2 years ago?"
Mr. Taylor?
Oh, yeah, just
Yeah.
building on what Chris said, and going back to the question of how do you recognize when the campaign is in. If you build seasons in and you go with that format, it's okay if it ends because it's just one season, right? You still have accomplished something. You've gotten to the end of at least one arc, even if it's not your whole 40-page design document plan. If it didn't reach all the way to there, at least you can do is struggle on to the end of your current arc, your current season, and give some resolution to the players. That's all. I really like that idea, Chris, and I think putting in your adventures into an episode and collecting those into arcs or seasons at least give you a little bit of closure.
One of the greatest campaigns I think we ever did was there was a huge villain that we knew we were aspiring against, but then the seasons, like we kept going through all our levels. When we finally, Alessandra, when we finally actually ended and fought the big bad, the real big bad, it was like this huge backdrop that we were finally able to tackle. It was very cool. If you can keep a campaign going long enough to set that up, it's very satisfying.
Can I add something?
Yes, Chris.
I was looking through my notebook as Chris and Greg were talking and looking at, I've sketched out here level bands, 5 levels from 1 to 30 with various villains and themes that I might want to bring into my campaign. And I was looking at this and thinking, well, I don't really know how I'm going to end my campaign yet, but that could be a good ending point. Oh, and actually, that could be a good ending point too. So, like Mike was saying about if you think of it in terms of seasons, then we could end this campaign at the end of any one of these level bands.
Sort of. Once you recognize the symptoms, like you were saying, hey, we haven't met in 2 months, or now my players are not responding to my emails. Oh, okay, perhaps this is the end.
They're actually saying it's spam. I don't know how. Here's how let's talk about mood lighting. Let's talk about music. How do we keep the romance alive, guys? How do we actually make people stay engaged in the campaign and keep their interest level attached throughout the entire course of it? Greg, let's start with you. You seem like a mood lighting guy.
I do have music in my games. I think that part of it is controlling the tension in the games, because if you're at a constant level of like high tension, it's actually going to be hard to keep the romance alive. Trying to make sure that your game has both valleys and peaks, that you recognize the sort of the story arcs and you bring tension to the end at the end of the story arc, and then let it dip down a little bit. It's okay that players, when they go back to town, they have some time to relax, but then that's when you get them, right? The tension strikes again, and I think that sustaining that over 10, 20, even 30 levels is tricky, but a lot of it just has to do with recognizing what your players want out of it. Seeing where they are taking their characters, where they are taking where they want the game to go, and then delivering that to them.
Yeah, I don't want to step on you guys, but I'm sure you can bring this up. Like surprising them one night, literally, with something really cool, a set piece or something. It's just they didn't expect it. It was just one Wednesday night, and then all of a sudden they come in and they're like, "Whoa, that's so cool!" That's a great way to keep them like on the edge of their toes. Okay, Chris.
I'm actually going to jump back in
All right.
with an example, which was just in my past game last week. I put out 6 beholders on the table, which, even though that wasn't an overwhelming encounter for them, it was one of those wow moments, and that immediately snapped everybody's attention. It brought attention to the table, and I think having those moments is very important.
Yeah, very important. I think didn't you, Mike, do a roll initiative one night? Just like literally, we just showed up and it was roll initiative. Michael,
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Starting out in the middle of the combat,
Yeah,
especially after like what you were saying, Greg, with the peaks and valleys. It's important to just recognize when you've sort of been doing the same thing over and over again. This is going to sound like a relationship advice now,
Which is like keeping the romance alive.
Right.
It's not that different.
Yeah, just change it up, try something new. You think about like watching a movie, right, or a film. Like there's those moments of intense action, everyone's high stress and everything, and then okay, now we're safe, now we can talk and do some exposition. It's actually finding like a screenwriting or a movie making for dummies, like that kind of a thing, and just getting the basic elements even of how filmmakers craft their stories. it's a really good way to figure out how to craft your campaigns too.
Do you want to speak briefly to the flashback, flash forward thing you did in Savage Tide?
Oh yeah. So in our campaign that where Mark is running in, one session we started off in the middle of the session, right? So we sat down around 7 o'clock and this is our normal start time, and it's where we would have been at 10 or 11 if the evening had gone in a standard way. So, all right, you're in the midst of burning village. Your swords are bloody. You've down these surges. You've used these powers are gone. What do you do? And they're surrounded by monsters. And like, well, I hit that guy who's trying to be my friend, and they started just to go. And after playing for an hour or two, I said, okay, we'll wipe that. Do the Star Wars, thing. And okay, you pull into the village. It's placid. The leaders come out to greet you with baskets of fruit, and they had an opportunity to hear the villagers explain the problem. We have some monsters coming, help us. And so they were able to say, okay, well, what are your assets? What are your resources? Okay, we'll plan to deal with the monsters in these ways, and we'll build the Endor log smasher thing. They were able to build some plans, and then back to where we started and say, okay, now that is there, and they got to pull on these different traps that they had laid, and the secrets of rental reinforcements,
And the cool thing about that is like you're giving the players authorship, which is one of the coolest things you could do in a campaign. Listening to players is the thing you'll hear all of us say over and over and over again. Listen to your players, let them also write the story. That is a big part of it, and you get great ideas from your players. Chris, do you want to speak with the romance?
With me, and not to beat the TV episode analogy to death, but it's what sort of keeps the players coming back is just their interaction with characters that they really like. Not just the other players, but recurring NPCs that they relate to, they're concerned about, or they hate, and they just want to see some conclusion to some of these characters. In some cases, a bloody, horrible conclusion.
Like the Amber Shards, wasn't that like the big?
The whole thing we did yesterday.
It was great to see some changes, yeah.
Yes, exactly. The previous series of podcasts we did had the Amber Shards really sort of got off scot-free, and there was a great impetus on the part of the players to get back together and kick their ass. So that was one of the big drivers.
Did you feel that, Mike, by the way? Did you feel that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting, and that's very different from like the campaign I run. My players, all of us come from video games, and so they're not as into. I mean, they like the story, but what they want are mechanics. So I try to surprise them, but I surprise them with weird gameplay ideas. I posted all this stuff on the site, but I did like the mirror puzzle with a laser pointer, and I've built 3D planets out of styrofoam and had them jumping back and forth. Like they never know, like they're gonna play D&D, but they never know how I will screw with it.
And that's not to encourage another giggle to tweet to the audience, but bringing in props is a good way to. And Mike, we're really good at that. Like you've seen the site, and he had on one of your sessions, I think you started off and they were falling into a canyon or a crater or something.
Yeah, I built a free fall and had clear plexiglass tiers. But I've sort of discovered that I think what I like is crafts. I don't need an outlet for that. Like my favorite thing now is a trip to Michael's, which is a lot.
Because like it's true, crafts are, but obviously we're not all that talented that we can do that. I'm not. So how would you do? What's a low budget version of props? How can you keep the romance alive without Michaels?
Well, for instance, you could just take a session and kind of play it mood-wise a little bit differently. Like, for instance, last year I ran a session that happened to fall on Halloween. So during that game, sort of injected into the regular campaign was this sort of very strongly Halloween-themed episode. And then you darken the lights and put some candles out. And immediately the character players...
No, seriously, keep the romance alive. Not the DM back rub, that is weird.
But some of your players aren't.
Not turning it down. But it just shakes things up for one session so that it creates that idea of they're not really sure what's going to happen next week.
Anyone else?
One of the things that I've done a couple of times in this new campaign I'm running is, so it took a while, first of all, to get all the players together. Finally able to schedule the first session. I've got 8 people in my campaign, and only had like 6 for the first session. So we had one person over for dinner a week or so after the first session and ran a flashback with her character and my wife's character. And I did that for 2 players, and then our last session we had a couple people miss, and so I ran another kind of side track. Here's what your characters were doing while the rest of the group was off doing this. And I found that's been a really exciting way to get everybody a little bit more in-person time, more spotlight time, and more chance to develop what their character's involvement in the story is.
If we have a second, I'd like to add one thing. We were mentioning a diceless game a while ago, and one thing that I know really got my players excited was a lot of times, especially after 2 years, they get to the point where they know that I'm going to try to counteract everything they do. I'm sitting at the table, I'm listening to all their plans. I know exactly how they plan to do it, and I'm going to stop. And so I gave them a scenario where they had to rescue someone who was about to be executed in Sigil. And I had no idea how they would do it, but what I did is I left the room so they could plan it. And they planned this entire Ocean's 11 style rescue. What was great is every time they would, I would think I had them, and then another part of their plan would kick off, and I'd be like, oh, you guys, and they loved it. Like, that was a nice twist. I think they really appreciated it.
Yeah, I think it's tough, right? Like, if you're there and you're at the table, it's hard for you not to actually foil their plans, but at the same time, removing yourself is a way of being surprised yourself. And let's be honest, part of the Dungeon Master is keeping yourself interested, right? I mean, you're the one driving the boat. You've got to stay engaged.
I loved it just as much. I mean, first of all, I was so proud of them. And second of all, like, I got this experience at the end where I was like, that aha moment where the villain is like, you got me, like that was me.
Very cool. Hey, by the way, you guys, if you start lining up now, we'll take some Q&A. But yeah, that's great. Like, this kind of the end of the baggage workshop. Like I said,
We're 30 minutes in, basically. 12:30. Let's go.
More broad